I'm Roberta Glass, and you're listening to my True Crime Report. On the evening of March 1st, 1932, aviator Charles Lindbergh's 20-month-old son was abducted from his crib on the second floor of the Lindbergh's Hopewell, New Jersey estate. The kidnapper left a note in the baby's room demanding $50,000. With the help of an eccentric retired schoolteacher named John F. Condon, who acted as a go-between for Charles Lindbergh and his wife Anne Morrow, the ransom money was paid off. Unfortunately, the baby was never returned, and on May 12th, a truck driver discovered the remains of Charles Lindbergh Jr. on the side of the road several miles from the Lindbergh Sourland estate. In 1934, the ransom money was traced back to an illegal immigrant, one Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a carpenter who was living in the Bronx. He was tried and convicted in what was called the trial of the century in 1935, and after unsuccessful appeals on April 3, 1936, Bruno Richard Hauptmann was executed in the electric chair. And to speak with me about this case is Richard T. Cahill, author of the excellent book Hoffman's Ladder, which is published by Kent University Press. Cahill holds a BA in History and Political Science from Mount St. Mary College, as well as a JD from Albany Law School. As a lawyer, he's practiced both civil and criminal law, with experience both as an assistant DA working for the state and a criminal defense attorney. Welcome, Richard T. Cahill.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. How did you get interested in the Lindbergh case?
Well, as I actually put right at the beginning of the book in the introduction, it started in my freshman year of college. My English 101 professor assigned us a research paper. So I figured, well, no problem. I'd read some about the Lincoln conspiracy. I'd write about that. But the professor was smarter than that, and he made it clear that the rules were that it had to be something you'd never read about before. And I considered pretending I'd never read about it, but I figured, well, what the heck, let's follow the rules. So I went to the library at college, and I found this small book that had a series of like 2, maybe 3-page articles, and they were the types of things like, did Billy the Kid die the way history records? Was John Wilkes Booth killed at Garrett's barn, and so forth. And one of them was, did Bruno Richard Hauptmann kidnap and kill the Lindbergh baby? Read that article. I remembered years ago watching an old TV show called In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy. And the only thing I could remember about it was that there was a guy with a mustache who didn't think that Hauptmann did it. I would find out years later that person was Anthony Scaduto, who wrote another book about it. And so I wrote my research paper. I believe I got a B or a B plus. I think it was a B. And should have got an F. It was terrible. But in any instance, then I read another book about it, The Airman and the Carpenter by the late Sir Lindbergh Kennedy. And then at that point, I actually was firmly entrenched in the idea that Hauptmann didn't do it, although I had certain things about the evidence that bothered me because Scaduto and Kennedy disagreed on a lot. And then I read a book by Jim Fisher, who was an FBI agent, and he wrote The Lindbergh Kidnapping, and he argued vehemently that Hauptmann did it, and he did it alone, and so forth. And so I thought, well, let me take a few weeks to look at the actual evidence. I'll have some time, and then we'll go from there. Well, 20 years later, I ended up having my book come out, and one was to make, because I always wanted to write a book, but the other was so nobody would have to go through the crap that I went through for 20 years trying to figure out whether he did it or not.
Yeah, what made you stick with it for 20 years? What was pushing you on?
I'm a stubborn SOB, what can I tell you?
Was there one piece of evidence, or was there one particular thing that was conflicting that you were researching, or?
Well, for example, Anthony Scaduto argued that the body of the baby that was found was not the Lindbergh baby. He argued that it was a body from an orphanage nearby. Sir Lindbergh Kennedy argued vehemently that it was a Lindbergh baby, but that Hauptmann didn't do it. So whether or not you actually have the body of the Lindbergh baby is a pretty big piece of evidence and a big question that has to be resolved. So there were large discrepancies between them. And when you read Jim Fisher's book, he basically lashes the other authors as to what they wrote and so forth. And I didn't know that much about Anthony Scaduto, but Sir Ludovic Kennedy had a very strong reputation. So I figured there had to be something on both sides, and so I started looking through it, and it became an absolutely fascinating case, and it just had me hooked.
Yes, Scaduto was a music journalist, and he also wrote in pornographic magazines like Penthouse, and quite the opposite, reputation-wise,
Yeah, he generally would advise that he was an author for the New York Times, that he wrote for the New York Times. But regardless, whatever he wrote for, he did write a book, and it's an interesting read.
Every time you see clips of him, he's very impassioned, and he's simplifying kind of the case a bit. Your book is so interesting, and one of my favorite true crime books, because it examines the myths as much as the facts. So, you're writing about the case, but you're also addressing the myths. Why was that important to you?
One of the frustrating things about trying to do research is that there were certain things that were reported early on that were wrong, but were never really challenged. And you would get third-party sources reporting it as if it was true. One of the examples I mentioned was that in the case, the police found a board, they found in Hauptmann's closet the name and original phone number for Dr. John Condon, who was the go-between. Well, a rumor went around at that time that a Daily News reporter named Cassidy had planted the evidence. It wasn't true, but it was a rumor that went around, as you'll see a lot. If you think back when we had the O.J. Simpson case, which was another tremendous, huge trial with a lot of media coverage, there were things that came out early on that turned out not to be true. Well, the problem is third-party sources actually report that Cassidy myth as being true. And it becomes very difficult when you are discussing the case or debating the case to get people to understand that, yeah, I know you read it in a book, but it isn't true. So we had to go back, and you had to go back to the original sources and find these things. And then you find out things you never knew that largely were never reported. I mean, there was a guy that came forward during the trial that was supposedly a lookalike for Hauptmann. And there was rumors he was going to be a witness for the defense and so forth. And not a lot of people mentioned it. I used it because I thought it was interesting, but it was only a minor thing. But, there's so much out there on this case that, you could write probably 4 or 5 books just from different perspectives on the case.
What was the crime scene like? When the police arrived, what was left? What were the clues?
When the baby is found to be missing, it was the nursemaid that initially saw the baby missing, and she went to Mr. and Mrs. Lindbergh to see if either of them had the child. They didn't. So when Charles Lindbergh himself bounded up the stairs and he went in, he saw that the child was missing. The blanket was still pinned to the mattress, so it was clear the child could not have gotten out himself. On the windowsill was an envelope, which Lindbergh concluded was likely a ransom note. Some authors have condemned him, saying, well, how did he know what it was? Well, what else would it have been? If
right.
It wasn't something family left and your child is missing and there's a mysterious envelope, it's not a Herculean leap of logic to conclude that it was a ransom note. So they called the police. Lindbergh and his butler, Ollie, went outside and they looked around. Beneath the window where they had seen the ransom note outside, they found, I'll call it ladder marks. It was like 2 holes in the shape of a ladder. If you take a wooden ladder and plop it into mud, it would leave 2 impressions. In addition, they found a set of footprints leading away. Not far from that, as they followed those prints, they found a 2-piece assembled ladder. They also saw a wood chisel, a 3/4-inch Buck Brothers wood chisel. And not far from that, they found the 3rd piece of the ladder. That was all they found. They went back in. The first police arrived, and Lindbergh and Ollie show them what they found. Some more police arrive. They say they find the same thing. So now they go inside, and the state police have arrived by now, and they finally open up the envelope. They dusted the envelope and the letter for prints. They don't find any. And although people would say, well, why wouldn't there be prints on paper? The techniques for getting fingerprints in those days were very different than what they are now. In any instance, and if you'd use the modern ones now, it's worthless because it's been handled so many times over the years. Nevertheless, they read the note. The note is written. It's written in English, but it has, when you read it, it has the sound of someone who did not speak English as their primary language. It sounded as someone who actually spoke German, the sentence structure, the way words were said, and just the tone of the letter. Interestingly, though, the more difficult words were spelled correctly, and some of the easier words like money were spelled wrong. The only big word that was spelled wrong was at the end. Instead of signature, it was spelled signature, S-I-N-G-N-A-T-U-R-E. So the police theorized that the kidnapper's native language was German, and that for some of the more difficult words he used an English-German dictionary, but for some words he felt more confident with, he didn't, and got them wrong. On that ransom note, there was what the kidnapper called a signature, which was a series of symbols, circles, and holes in the paper that would come to be known as the signature or the symbol, and it was on most of the ransom notes, all the ones sent to Lindbergh, not all on all of the ones sent to John Condon, but in any instance, so that's what they have. Now they go back outside when the state police are there, and the state police come out, and they notice that the media has arrived, and they're all over the place, in fact, touching the ladder. So they had to take the ladder and the chisel and so forth inside to preserve the scene. So as a result, there are no pictures of the ladder and chisel as they were found that night because they didn't secure the scene. Now they notice, for the first time, new footprints leading away from the evidence they found, heading off to the southeast. Now, the original prints were described as stocking feet impressions. They believed that either the kidnapper had wrapped his feet with a cloth or perhaps taken his shoes off. They weren't sure which. But these new footprints they found were described as overshoe or boot prints. And they went off to the southeast, and they went to a dirt road called Featherbed Lane, and there they disappeared, and there were some tire tracks. So they thought at the time that the kidnapper had gone off in that direction. Sometime later, they would actually find what's called a thumb guard. Now, a lot of listeners may not know what that is. Back at that time, it was a metal device that went over the baby's thumbs, and it had a string on it, and then it was gently tied. This way the baby couldn't suck his or her thumb. Not used today, but they were used at one time. They found one of those, the one that belonged to the missing baby. It was crushed, and it was in the driveway. And for that to be where it was suggests, at least to me and to a lot of modern researchers, that the kidnapper actually went a different direction, and those second set of boot prints were not that of the kidnapper. That is a disputed point, but I'll state pointedly that I think those who dispute that point are wrong. I don't see how you can argue that it belongs to the kidnapper when they were not seen until after the reporters were there. But the point I'm ultimately making in this very brief answer is that the scene was not very well preserved. Now, overall, the state police of New Jersey did a good job, but not that first night. They did not secure the scene very well, and as a result, a lot of the initial evidence was destroyed or of questionable evidentiary value now. Fortunately, they kept the ladder and brought it inside because that would become the single most important piece of evidence, thus the title of my book, Hauptmann's Ladder.
Anne Morrow and Charles Lindbergh weren't supposed to be at the Sauerland estate on that Tuesday. So a lot of people think that maybe someone in the house was connected to Hauptmann or the kidnappers, or there was... Yes. What's your take on it?
Well, there's a lot to that. First off, it is well known now that the Lindberghs were not there on Tuesdays. It was not that well known then. It was a fact, but it wasn't like they advertised, hey, we're at the house on the weekends. The house had recently been built. The construction was done, but there were still things they needed to do. There were no curtains on the windows and things like that. And so they generally were staying there on the weekends, and then during the week they were staying at the Inglewood estate, which was basically Charles Lindbergh staying with his in-laws. So the child had developed a cold, and Mrs. Lindbergh had a cold as well. And it was decided they would hold over for a few days before going over. So they brought over Betty Gow, the nursemaid from the Inglewood estate. She became an early suspect because she was supposed to have a date that night, and she called the date to cancel. And, of course, now the police are looking at that saying, well, there was a phone call out here. Could she have notified somebody? They eventually tracked down the person that she had been dating, and they were able to clear him. But so a lot of people say, well, geez, how did the kidnapper know that they were there? It's not necessarily required that he did know that. Had he been there that day, he could have easily determined, because there were no curtains on the windows, anybody with a decent pair of field glasses, because the area was cleared by the house, but beyond the clearing there was woods. So anybody could have been there, been unseen, and would have known the child was there, because hours earlier, Mrs. Lindbergh went for a walk, and she stopped underneath the nursery room window, and Betty Gow held the child up to wave at his mother. So anybody watching could have seen it that time. So it's not required that the kidnapper knew that they were going to be there. It could have been just one of those, he went there that night and they happened to be there. A lot of cases have involved just happenstance and so forth. It happens. You said, well, what's the odds? Well, the odds aren't great, but it's what happened.
Yeah, interesting. One of the also big myths around this case is from a PBS documentary that Charles Lindbergh was a eugenicist. There was something wrong with the baby and he arranged to kidnap his own child. Where do you think that stems from, and what do you think of that?
Exactly where it stems from. It has several points. Early on, Charles Lindbergh and his wife kept the baby away from the media. From the moment Charles Lindbergh landed in Paris with his plane, and in France, the media was all over him, and Charles was uncomfortable with that. He didn't like it. So he and Anne had decided they would keep the baby away from the media. The media didn't understand this. Why would they not bring him out? There must be something wrong. And so all kinds of speculation went around, oh, there's something wrong with the baby. And this is long before the kidnapping. The baby wasn't that old, but it was prior to the kidnapping. In any instance, eventually there was a press conference, and Will Rogers, who was a prominent individual then and was friends with Charles Lindbergh, actually addressed the media and asked them to knock it off, that there was nothing wrong with the child. Now, child gets kidnapped. Years later, a book comes out from authors Monier and Algren called Crime of the Century, where they contend that Charles Lindbergh, who was a known practical joker, they contend with no evidence to support their theory that Charles Lindbergh was intending to play a joke, that he was going to pretend to kidnap the baby, get everybody all upset, and then bring the baby out, ha ha, aren't I funny? While doing it, he dropped the baby and the baby accidentally died. And they say, well, he created the kidnapping myth to cover his behind, and therefore was a cold-blooded killer because he let somebody go to the electric chair that he knew was not guilty. Problem with that, beyond the fact that they have no evidence, is we know where Charles Lindbergh was that evening, and he didn't have time to do all the things he would have had to have been done. So that theory has been largely discredited. Then a prominent professor from Rutgers University named Lloyd Gardner, he wrote a book called The Case That Never Dies. And in his original version of the book, he simply concluded that Hauptmann didn't do it. In the next version of the book, he came up with a new theory. He pointed out that Lindbergh was into eugenics, which is true. That was not an uncommon thing in those days. And he argued that there was something wrong with the baby. I think he said he had rickets or something like that. There's no medical evidence to back it. And so what he has tried to allege is that Hauptmann apparently was involved, because now you can't say Hauptmann wasn't involved. The evidence ever since the Forensic Files episode, which went over all the old science and proved that the old science was accurate, nobody can now say that Hauptmann wasn't involved in some way. So now the thought is, well, let's make him a player, a minor player. And so Gardner has alleged that Lindbergh arranged for the kidnapping and so forth to get rid of the baby. The baby died accidentally. He was going to send the child over to Europe, I believe he said, and so forth. There's no evidence to support it. And what he points to is he says, well, Lindbergh had multiple children with different women, including 2 who were sisters. Well, that's true. But just because he couldn't keep it in his pants doesn't mean he was a murderer.
Right.
It's illogical. Pardon me for being so direct, but there's no evidence to support these theories that Lindbergh had anything to do with it. He wasn't, a superb human being, and he did have affairs with other women and had other children, which has now been proven scientifically. So he was not a saint. Right. He wasn't a murderer, and there's no evidence that he was a murderer. I mean, I don't advocate that he be made a hero and have a national holiday, but you can't then turn around and say, well, because he wasn't a good guy, he was a murderer. I mean, that's the standard. If you're a jerk and that makes you a murderer, then 90% of the world is a murderer, because 90% of the world often is a jerk. I mean, that's just how it is.
Right.
So you can't correlate one to the other.
But he was so beloved at the time. He was, a national hero. Could you compare his celebrity to anyone today?
When Senator Barack Obama ran for president, it was something like that. He was a sensation. He came out of nowhere. You have to look at the times, though, because they'd had, the Depression, and the economy still had not largely recovered. People were down, they were hurting, and here comes somebody who did something that was never done before, and he became a sensation. Now, it's not like today where you've got the 24/7 news cycle where they're all digging for dirt and so forth. At that time, if you were a media sensation, oh my God, it was wonderful, and everybody wanted to hear things about you. Today it's much more difficult to get that type of rock star publicity, without getting criticism of some sort, because it's just the way the media is now. Don't get me wrong; they could be despicable too in those days, but it was in a different way.
There's such great characters in this story. One of them is John Condon. Japsy? Is it?
Jafsie.
Japsy. Who was he, and how did he get involved in the case?
He was a semi-retired lecturer and educator. He had been a principal for basically an elementary school for many years. He was a local busybody in the Bronx, and he was, an occasional lecturer at Fordham University. And he was one of these individuals who, the way I like to describe him is, in every town you go into a local tavern, and there's a guy there who's an older guy who can tell a great story, and whether he's telling the truth or not, or he's exaggerating, nobody knows, but most people like him. Some think he's a pain in the butt. Well, that's how Condon was. He was an over-the-top personality. Now, how he got involved in the case. In my opinion, he got involved in the case by accident. His bluff got called. What happened was he wrote a letter to a paper called the Bronx Home News. Now, people wonder why he chose the Bronx Home News and not a bigger paper. The reason was he knew the editor, and he knew his letter would get in the paper. So he wrote this big letter. And everybody says he wrote the letter offering to be a go-between. No, he didn't. He offered $1,000 of his own money, which in those days was a heck of a lot of money. It's nothing to sneeze at now, but by comparison, it was a tremendous amount of money then. And what he wrote in the letter was he would offer the money if the kidnapper would bring the child to a Catholic priest. He reasoned that if it was done in the confessional, the Catholic priest could never reveal the name, which is true, but if it wasn't in a confessional, he just walked up to the priest and gave him it wouldn't necessarily. But he put it out there. Next thing you know, he gets a letter. He opens it up, and inside is a letter for him and another envelope. And the letter basically says, Mr. Dr. John Condon, which sounds like a strange salutation, except if you understand that in German, a doctor is called Herr Doktor, or Mr. Doctor, again showing the kidnapper has Germanic roots in all likelihood, or at least that's his language, his primary spoken language. So he reads the letter, and it basically says, if you want to be the go-between, strictly follow the enclosed instructions, and I'm paraphrasing. And so he calls up Charles Lindbergh after, of course, he runs right out to tell some of his friends, look how important I am. But he calls up, and whether he got Lindbergh or he got one of his secretaries is a disputed point. Nobody knows for sure. It's possible he got Lindbergh, but assuming he did, he read the letter, and Lindbergh or whomever it was didn't seem that interested. And he said, well, do you want me to open up the inside letter? Sure. And so it opens it up, and it basically says, information about how the ransom is to be paid and that Condon can be the go-between. And just before the call was to end, John Condon says, there's a strange symbol at the bottom of this internal note. What do you mean? He described it, he said, as secant circles, which is another way of describing the symbol. At this point, the caller, Lindbergh or whomever, realized that this letter is likely legitimate, and so they said, well, why don't you come out to the house? So, of course, Condon took that literally, and he left immediately, and he arrived at about 3 o'clock in the morning. And it went from there. So I believe that he particularly was putting a letter out so that people who would say, look at that, he offered $1,000 of his own money. What a swell guy. I think that's what he was thinking. He wanted a pat on the back and people to think what a great guy he was. And next thing you know, his whole life was changed. He was part of the case.
And it culminates in a meeting in the cemetery with what we can assume is Hauptmann. What happened in the cemetery, and what do you think of the job that Condon did?
Okay, well, there were 2 meetings in 2 different cemeteries. The first one, I think, is the more interesting of the 2 because it tells you a lot about John Condon. He met with whoever it was come to be known Cemetery John because the person, when he asked him his name, he said, call me John. I'll be up front and say that I believe that Cemetery John was Hauptmann, so I'll use them interchangeably. In any instance, they're meeting by a cemetery gate, and all of a sudden they hear something. And Hauptmann, or Cemetery John, thinks it's the police. He climbs over the gate and he takes off running. Turns out it was a guy named Riel, R-I-E-H-L, who was a cemetery guard. Now, according to Condon, he took off and chased after Hauptmann, caught up to him, grabbed him by the arm, pulled him down onto a bench, gave him a stern lecture, and then they sat and talked for an hour. Well, Condon was brought to there because Condon didn't drive. He was brought by a person of his who was described as his bodyguard. He was a professional boxer, and a decent one. He actually got in the ring with Jack Dempsey. Lost, but most people lost when they fought Dempsey. But anyway, he observed it, who was a distance away, too far away to identify Cemetery John as Hauptmann, said, well, yeah, the guard showed up. The person who was there jumped over the fence and ran. Condon chased after him, and the man running stopped, and Condon caught up to him, and then they sat on a bench and they talked. So what you have is the basic facts. Cemetery John ran, Condon chased him, they ended up on a bench in Van Cortlandt Park, and they talked for an hour. But, of course, Condon has to glorify it and talk about how I chased him down and gave him a stern lecture. And after a while, when you start getting all this extra baloney on top of the truth, and every time it gets retold, there's a little bit more baloney, it gets difficult to know what's truthful and which part is said baloney. So it creates problems.
Can you talk about the second cemetery meeting?
Happy to.
Thank
At
you.
the second cemetery meeting, Condon meets up with the same man, Cemetery John, or as I believe, Hauptmann, and eventually they make the ransom payment. It was supposed to be $70,000. Originally, the ransom notes asked for 50, and then when the police got involved, they said, well, now it's got to be 70 because we have to hold the baby longer. So then Condon basically says to the man, hey, this is difficult times. Not even Lindbergh has tremendous amounts of money in these tough times. You wanted 50. Why don't you take 50? And Cemetery John, a.k.a. Hauptmann, says, okay, if we can't get 70, we'll take 50, which in and of itself shows that if there were more people involved, he's either the top guy or confident enough to make that deal. So he gives him the $50,000. Hauptmann gives him a note that says that the child is on Boad Nelly, B-O-A-D, referring to boat. And so Lindbergh and Condon and two others eventually get on a plane and they search the area where the boat's supposed to be, but they never find anything. It turns out it's a hoax. They've been conned. And then not long thereafter, on May the 12th, the body of the Lindbergh baby is found in a wooded area approximately 5 miles from the Lindbergh house.
I've read your book twice, once when it first came out, and, once before this interview. And I had so much more sympathy for Condon this time, He wants to be, looked up to. He wants to be the moral guy, probably be the guy, do the moral thing. But he is like a kind of a blowhard and an attention seeker, too.
I think they made an old nursery rhyme about him. It was called The Boy Who Cried Wolf.
Yeah.
You start doing all this after a while, and then your credibility comes into question.
Yeah. And I can't remember if it's the first meeting or the second meeting. Hauptmann says to him, will I burn if the baby's dead?
Yes.
Why does that get so ignored?
I don't know that I would say that it's been ignored. It was something that was very prominent in the case. I think it gets a little less attention now than it did because at the time when it first came out, would I burn if the baby's dead, indicates to anybody who knows what they're doing that the baby is dead. Why would he be concerned about burning if the baby's alive? Now, after all these years, when we know the Lindbergh baby died, we see the pictures of the remains and we know how horrible it was. It's not as stunning or as shocking. At the time, though, when they thought the baby was alive or hoped that the baby was alive, it was a stunning thing.
And the police thought the mob were involved. I mean, the notes are so obviously German. Was there a German mob? Why did they think the mob was involved?
No, it had nothing to do with as far as German. In those days, it was not uncommon for the mob to kidnap children of prominent people, and as long as the ransom was paid, the child was generally returned. So there was some initial suspicion. In fact, the two original go-betweens that Lindbergh suggested were two small-time racketeers. Even Al Capone tried to get in on the act from prison, asking to be let out so he could get to the bottom of it. The experienced investigators never really believed, however, that it was the mob because the kidnapping was not done in the most efficient way. It was a poorly done job, and they believed, and rightfully so, that if the mob had been involved, it would have been done and would have been done right. The mob doesn't normally make big mistakes, and they don't normally do something in a very poor manner. When they set out to do something, they generally do it. So there was some initial thought about it, but that faded rather quickly.
And mobster Frank Costello was asked his opinion, and he had some interesting remarks. Can you talk about that?
There were a number of different people that made remarks. At the moment, as I'm sitting here, Costello's remarks don't come into my head.
He said the baby is dead, and it's not the mob. And I just thought that was so interesting.
That wouldn't be a surprise for anybody who knows what they're doing to say. A lot of the police thought that the baby was likely dead. That it was a real possibility because it was clearly a ham and egg show. And anybody who had any experience in mob would have known this was not a mob job. It was done sloppily. The mob wouldn't use a homemade ladder. It would have been done, efficiently. This was clearly done by an amateur. The ransom note, you can tell who wrote it. It's not, it's a ham and egg operation at best. This was not a supreme mastermind criminal. And if he had been, it wouldn't have been difficult to get away with it. But based on how science was in those days, it might have eventually been figured out. I'm not surprised anybody, Costello or otherwise, who was involved would say it's not the mob because word would have gotten around. And plus, just the way the kidnapping was done, it was obvious to anybody with any type of law enforcement experience or mob experience that this was not their style.
I guess the theory of this crime is that Hauptmann, his ladder broke. This is a toddler, 20-month-old
Yes.
kid, broke under the weight of the ladder. The baby hit one of the windowsills and died during the crime. What did he think he was going to do with this baby?
That is, to me, the most interesting question in all of this. In my research, I found, I'm not the first to find it, but I'm the first to write about it in a book. In the New York City Municipal Archives, I found in what was supposed to be materials found in Hauptmann's home, a rental application that was seeking to rent an apartment for a period of 6 months beginning on March 1st, 1932. An interesting date since that's the date of the kidnapping. And it was an apartment supposedly with a kitchen, and it had 2 fake names on it, Mr. Lynch and Mr. Jones. So if that is what it purports to be, and I cannot state definitively that it is because I wasn't overly impressed with the security at that particular location at that time. So someone could have slipped it in. But it seemed legit. And if that is legit, that would be the one piece of evidence suggesting that the intention was to hold the baby and then return it for money. The other thing that leads me to believe that the intention was not to kill the baby is how sloppily the baby was buried. The hole was dug likely with a boot heel, not with a shovel. If Hauptmann was intending to kill the baby, you would think that they would have had a shovel and dug a better hole and so forth. It was done haphazardly. And
also the other big mystery is his wife, who stuck by him, never remarried, always championed his innocence. Yes, and yet they found the money right above a place where she keeps her coupon. Is it above or around where she kept her coupons? And she says she never had any idea. He's not working. No. They have all this money.
No, the money was found in the garage.
Okay.
Haupt claimed that the way he got the money was a former business partner named Isidor Fish, who had since returned to Germany and died from tuberculosis, or what was then called consumption, gave him a shoebox, and that he put the shoebox in the area you just described, up on the top shelf, and that later there was a flood in there, and he took it out, and when he took it out, he saw that it was full of money. And the question was whether Anna would have ever seen it or not, because she probably would have seen the shoebox given where it was. But as far as her not knowing anything, you have to understand the time period. It was very different in the late 1920s, early 1930s than today. And the average housewife did not challenge her husband in those eras. And the man or the husband was considered to be in charge. And they often wouldn't ask questions. It's a different era. And please don't any listener think I'm advocating for that era. I'm not. I'm simply talking from a historical point of view, how it was. And so he was the breadwinner for the most part. She did work to some extent. She worked in Friedrichson's bakery. But she knew that he had additional money in that they had bought more things. It was an expensive radio and, other things like that. But if he told her, yeah, I'm just doing carpentry jobs and so forth, she wouldn't have questioned him, not in that time period. And I've looked very carefully. I have never found one piece of evidence that proves to my satisfaction that Anna Hauptmann knew anything about it or was involved in any way. So if there was a woman involved, it wouldn't have been her. It might have been a woman named Gerda Henkel. I'll be clear, there's no evidence to definitively prove this, but the police were suspicious that Hauptmann and Gerda Henkel were having an affair. And Anna did not like Gerda. She didn't go into detail why. The one thing she did say, and a lot of people don't understand this, she said, you to me. And the police didn't understand what that meant. She was a native German speaker. In German and in other foreign languages, they have a formal and an informal case. In German, it's Sie, S-I-E. When you first meet somebody who's not a close friend or a family, you use that formal you. You would say, are you there? You would say, sind Sie da? Are you there? If it's a close friend, you would say, bist du da? Are you there? If to use the informal you to someone you barely know is an insult. And so when she says she used you to me, it seems rather clear to me that she met Gerda for the first time and Gerda just presumed to use the informal form of German, which would be considered insulting. A minor thing, but an interesting one I always thought. But I guess that's just because I speak German. But that's what, that's what we have. There's no evidence that Anna knew anything about it until later.
You wouldn't think that Hauptmann was going to be taking care of the baby. I mean, it would seem so challenging to take care of a baby alone and be in another spot, and have to come home to your wife, with this rented room. It would make sense that there would have to be someone with some baby experience to take care of the child.
To me, that's the one mystery that has not been solved. I think it's pretty clear that Hauptmann was the main guy. Whether he had an accomplice is still a mystery. There is no evidence to show that there was an accomplice at the scene. The physical evidence at the scene does not support an accomplice other than possibly someone driving a getaway car. Certainly possible. The majority of the money ended up being with Hauptmann. If you believe the forensic accounting report, all of it went to him. Whether that forensic accounting report was, I don't know. I'm a lawyer and a writer. I'm not an accountant. But it is distinctly possible there was an accomplice. In fact, there's one piece of evidence that supports the idea of an accomplice that's never been refuted. When the ransom was paid, it was largely paid, not all of it, but a big portion of it was paid with gold certificates because President Roosevelt was taking the country off the gold standard, and these gold certificates were going to have to be turned in. And Elmer Ire, who was helping with the case, knew that because he worked for the Treasury. So they intentionally put a large number of these gold certificates because they would be easier to follow and trace than regular money. In any instance, at one point, somebody walked into one of the national banks and turned in close to $3,000. I believe, if memory serves me right, it was $2,980, but I'd have to double check my book to be certain in my notes. But I think that's about right. And every note was gold certificates and was part of the ransom money. So they came in, and the most they could find was the slip. And the slip had the name J.J. Faulkner. Now, they did a huge investigation. They found somebody at the address on there who lived there at one time who was known as J. Faulkner, not J.J., but J. Faulkner. And they cleared that person after a long investigation. Handwriting experts from then all the way till now have looked at it and have said that that handwriting does not match Bruno Richard Hauptmann, nor does it match Anna Hauptmann or anybody affiliated that they know of with the case. So that person either was an accomplice, possibly after the fact helping to launder the money, or was someone that got their hands on the money and realized it was hot. We don't know. But it's the one piece of physical evidence that could arguably support the idea of an accomplice. And your point that you made is also a very good one. The odds are that Hauptmann, if Hauptmann thought he was going to care for that baby on his own, he was a fool, because it would have been extremely difficult to do. That's not direct proof of an accomplice, but it's certainly circumstantial proof that the accomplice likely was needed. But there's no way to know for sure. He could have done this completely alone. Whether he did, we don't know, and probably never will know.
Yeah, you just mentioned the forensic accounting that was presented in trial. You call your book Hauptmann's Ladder. Why do you think the ladder, Rail 16, is the most significant piece of evidence?
Well, the short answer is because it is, but to give you a better answer, that piece of scientific evidence demonstrated beyond any doubt that Rail 16, what one time was a floorboard in the attic above the apartment that Hauptmann was in. And there was only one way into the attic, and it was through Hauptmann's apartment, which limits very strongly how anybody could have gotten there. It's been attacked and called junk science, but it's been revisited by modern scientists, and it's clear, and it's why very rarely now do you hear anybody saying that Hauptmann had nothing to do with it, because it is quite clear that the side rail, Rail 16 of the kidnap letter, came out of Hauptmann's attic, and there's really no way to dispute that. And that's why I called the book Hauptmann's Ladder, because the prosecutor at the case, David Walentz, or some people pronounce it a little differently, but whatever, the prosecutor announced that he was going to hang the ladder around Hauptmann's neck, and he did. The evidence proved definitively it came from a board in Hauptmann's attic, and nobody else really had access to it, and it couldn't have been faked. So they've always tried to say that, but scientifically it couldn't have been done.
There's also the Condon's phone number in his closet. There's the myth that the journalist put it there, but he changed his number to an unlisted number, so it was for someone to, plant that would be kind of absurd, no?
You'd be surprised in cases what people would plant. But Hauptmann, when he was asked about it, initially said, that's my handwriting. And then later said, well, there were other numbers on there. And he said, I wrote those, but I didn't write that one. I mean, it really wasn't convincing. It is strange to me that you would write it on a board in a closet. It does seem strange to me. He was a carpenter, so maybe to him it seemed normal. I don't know. There's no way to know for sure. I just know that Cassidy didn't have access, so he didn't have the ability to do it.
Right. Another claim that with the handwriting that the police made him misspell things, including the word signature. Can you talk about that?
There was always the claim that they forced him to misspell things and so forth. And some of the words he insisted in trial that they made him misspell were not in the handwriting itself. It was a poor way to try to attack it. The better way would have been to say say that, handwriting analysis is not like fingerprints or DNA. The DNA, it's yours or it's not. Fingerprint, it's yours or it's not. Handwriting analysis doesn't work that way. Handwriting analysis is great for ruling somebody out. If a handwriting analysis gives his or her opinion that it's that person's writing, that's all it is. It's their opinion. And it's much easier to rule somebody out, but to say this proves that that's the guy really doesn't do it. The truth of the matter is the handwriting analysis is interesting. I think it adds a little meat to the bone. But in my opinion, once you establish that rail 16 of that kidnap letter came from Hauptmann's attic, it's over. He's involved at that point. He's either built the ladder or he provided some of the wood that was used in making that ladder. And it becomes very difficult for him to get out from under it at that point. Everything else that gets piled on it is meat on the bone or icing on the cake, whatever expression you want to use.
A lot of people point to the fact that he always maintained his innocence up to the very end as a sign of his innocence. Why do you think he did that?
It's not uncommon. When Governor George W. Bush was elected president, there was a case they talked about in Texas where the guy insisted he didn't do it, and the governor had signed his death warrant. And eventually they ordered a DNA test before he was executed, and it turned out the DNA matched. He did it. And the guy went to his death, insisting he didn't do it. Just because someone says they didn't do it, even if they have a motive to agree to do it, doesn't prove anything. I'm sorry to burst people's bubble, but criminals lie.
Right.
Everybody says they didn't do it. I mean, in the movie The Shawshank Redemption, Morgan Freeman's character said, "I'm the only." I won't use the way he said it because I don't think the language would be appropriate. But he basically said, "I'm the only one in here who's guilty. Everybody else here got shafted." Use a different verb. Shafted by their lawyer or says they're innocent. I'm the only one in here that did it. It's not unusual for someone to say they didn't do it, and that's not proof in and of itself.
When did this become a sort of a popular position to take that Hauptmann was innocent? Did it start with Scaduto or
kind of? It became big in 1976 when his book came out. Then you had a series of others that came along in the 70s and 80s. And another thing that made it big was there was an attorney out of San Francisco who teamed up with Anna Hauptmann, and there were a series of federal lawsuits trying to get everything set aside. And I believe it was Governor Florio, if memory serves me right, he ordered that all of the evidence be put together at the New Jersey State Police Museum and Archive so it would be available. And that kind of brought it back, and then they did a couple of movies and so forth. And it kind of developed on its own. There were internet, what they used to call bulletin boards. I think they call them blogs now. But there were different internet sites that arose to it. And certain people had it in their minds that he's innocent or he's guilty. And they researched it based on that. And there's a lot of things in this case that we will never know for sure. And if you walk into it saying, I'm going to prove he did it or I'm going to prove he didn't do it, you're going to find a way, other than ignoring the latter evidence, you're going to find a way to try to make that argument because there's a lot of things in here where you have to make logical leaps. And if you're predisposed to see it a certain way, you're going to leap and try to get to where you want it to go. The trick is to follow the evidence and let the evidence lead you, not the other way around.
What do you think for someone researching any case? What's the most useful a case that's been tried? What's the most useful resources?
It varies. I mean, I've done two different true crime books. Hauptmann's Letter was the first. For me, the most valuable thing in researching the Lindbergh case was the New Jersey State Police Museum and Archives. They have such an incredible setup there with the original documents, and you can see some of the. Well, you get to look at the copies. You can actually see some of the evidence. They'll make you put on gloves, and they're very careful about it. Mark Frauzini, the archivist, does a wonderful job there, and he was very helpful. For the other case I did, which was about a murder in my hometown, I'll throw a shameless plug in. It's called Sidetrack, the betrayal and murder of Anna Kithcart. That was a murder that took place in my hometown. There, the most helpful thing was, since the murder had already been taken care of and the appeals were long gone, the district attorney's office let me look at their entire file with the exception of the grand jury minutes, because it's unlawful for me to see that. And they held back the autopsy report, although I saw it by other means. But I was able to get to see all of this. And once you have all of that stuff, it gives you that incredible foundation you need where you can then go off and look for specific things. But those were, in each of those cases, were the two things that really helped me to get a real grasp on the case.
So when you say documents, are you talking about case files and court documents, or?
They have the statements from the hundreds and hundreds of witnesses that were interviewed. They have reports from experts. They have internal police reports of how they did their investigation. They now have, thanks to efforts by myself and Mark Falzini, they now have the extradition transcripts, because Hauptmann lived in New York and he had to be extradited to New Jersey. And they had a hearing in front of a judge who I think has the greatest name I've ever heard for a judge. It was Judge Hammer. I love the name. But I actually almost thought of using it in my first fiction book that I have. But in any instance, I didn't, but I thought about it. But now they have that, and you can see the transcripts. And as you start to read these things, and you see they have files of reports of people who came in offering tips, which some turned out to be true, some turned out to be garbage. They have copies of all the old news articles. You name it, they've got it. They've got copies of almost every book ever written on it, and probably every single one, I would guess. They've got them all. And so it's a treasure trove for anybody who wants to learn about the Lindbergh case. The easy way is to read my book. If you want to do it the hard way and really see the original stuff, you make an appointment with Mark Falzini, because he's the man, and he'll have it all for you.
Why do you think HBO and PBS, the true story is so interesting? Why do you think that they pick these kind of angles?
I guess I could answer your question with a question. Why did you choose to do my book, in this case, on your True Crime podcast? Because it's a fascinating, I'm going to assume the answer is because it's a fascinating case that has stood the test of time. You have the reverse of the OJ case. In the OJ case, the celebrity was the accused. In the Lindbergh case, the celebrity was Charles Lindbergh. So here you have a fascinating case with mystery involved, with a celebrity to boot. And of course, in each case, the celebrity side won, not surprisingly, I would say. But it stands the test of time. The Kennedy assassination, that goes back into the early 60s. People still talk about it. It stands the test of time. Jack the Ripper goes into the 1880s. The largest group of anybody researching a case is not Kennedy or Lindbergh. It's Jack the Ripper. They actually call them Ripperologists. If you like this type of stuff, if you like true crime, if you like history, it's the type of case that grabs you and holds you. And it's just there's certain things that just grip people and stand the test of time. Perhaps the greatest execution that has held the test of time was the execution of Christ. There's no more talked about execution in the history of the world than that one. Certain things catch your attention and they stand a test of time. And the Lindbergh case is one of them.
But why the Hauptmann is innocent angle? Why push that?
When you're writing a book, what book will sell the most? If I wrote a book that said that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone and killed Kennedy, how much media attention do you think that would get? Not very much. If I wrote a book that said that Lyndon Baines Johnson orchestrated the whole thing, that gets attention. It's the squeaky wheel. So, there is an aspect in true crime writing where people look to be the one to say, no, it really didn't happen this way. I've got the inside story, ta-ta-ta, and now people want to read it. So some people do it because it's going to sell books. Some people actually believe it. There are some people who believe that the police are framing people all the time. There's different theories, but whenever you're the one who is writing that the what's recorded by history isn't what actually happened, that's going to get the most interest. Just like if you write about Sasquatch or Bigfoot, those who say he doesn't exist aren't going to sell as many books as those that say, not only is he real, but my book is called My Date with Bigfoot. I went out with him. You know what I mean? It's the sensational. And, and that's not, there's a lot of different reasons, but I think the ones that really sell are those. The San Francisco Zodiac. Every once in a while, a new book comes out and claims, it was my Uncle Charlie, and they sell a lot of books. It was like, oh my God, what do they have?
And he was also this killer and that killer, and he was all over the world, It's so funny that you mentioned Bigfoot, because that's what my friend said to me about my podcast. She said, Roberta, you're ruining people's Bigfoot, by bringing up the court documents and kind of ruining the fantasy. Also, if you don't have to stick to the evidence, you have endless possibilities if you can make stuff up. I think a criticism was, why do you keep talking about the same evidence? Well, the evidence doesn't change, unless I can, start to make it up. I don't know what else I'm going to talk about. So you bring up some good points. What are you working on now?
Well, actually, I have my first work of fiction coming out, although some Lindbergh people would say my old book was fiction, although they're wrong. It was true crime. But I have a book coming out July 28th. It's called The Aftermath, and it's the first of what I hope will be a series of novels about Connor Phelan in a attorney and detective from upstate New York. It's being put out by Bloodhound Books, and it's officially being released July 28th. I'm just waiting for the approval to allow me. They've put together the cover for it. It's beautiful. What a wonderful job they did. And but they have on the website, bloodhoundbooks.com, they will have a reveal. It's a big part of what they do, and they know what they're doing. I can write books, but as far as publishing them, that's their expertise, so I defer to them. And they're going to have a review of the cover, so I'm just waiting, because once that happens, then I can put the cover out on Twitter and on Facebook and all the other things and so forth. But that should be soon, and I had a lot of fun writing this book. I didn't have to research it as much as a true crime because it's fiction, so I can make things up. I just had to make sure certain things, were actually possible. And the fun for me was there's a lot of personal Easter eggs in this book that I've just written, because certain characters, at least in some way, are based on some people I've known or have known. One of my close friends forms the basis of a character in a book called Eddie Astorino. And when I was reading in the chapter, and all of a sudden he stopped and went, "Hey, that's me, isn't it?" And it was just, everybody in the room roared because they all knew about it already. He didn't. And it was just a lot of fun. And, the main character, Connor Phelan, is based about 75% on my late father. And that was just fun, picturing Dad in those circumstances and what he would say and so forth. It was a lot of fun. Writing Hauptmann's Ladder was fun too, but it took me a long time because you have to check every word and so forth, and you have to double check. And I'd be writing Hauptmann's Ladder, and I'd have to stop and go back and say, I better check that point, because they're going to go through it with a fine tooth comb and so forth. With the fiction, I still have to make sure it's plausible. I can't, have a crime fiction and say, well, this guy committed the murder because he sprouted wings. It doesn't work. But so I have to make sure the solution works and so forth. But it was a hell of a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward, and I've actually written the next book. And for the series, if this one does well, that one will come out.
The same character, same character.
Yes, Connor Phelan. It's the second Connor Phelan novel. That one's tentatively titled Summary Judgment, and I had a tremendous amount of fun writing that too. But the first one is The Aftermath, July 28th coming out, and I'm just waiting for the get-go to start hitting it. But this will be actually the second time I've mentioned it. I mentioned it one other time. And it was right around the time where Bloodhound Books signed me, so I was very excited. Now it's right on the precipice of coming out, and when you reached out to me to do this, I asked you, can I throw in a little plug for this, because I'm really excited about it. And it's a lot of people told me that Hauptmann's Ladder, even though it was true crime, read like a novel, and which is what I tried to do, because I wanted it to be something that the people who are into this, who are into true crime, who research it, can read it, look through the footnotes, and enjoy the work that was done. But those who don't know that much about it can not only find out about it, but they can enjoy the story without it being dry. And I think I accomplished it. I'd like to think I did. I felt confident I did when it won the award that it won. But, so now I can use that skill to write what sounds like a novel, but actually make it a novel. And it was really a lot of fun. I enjoyed it immensely.
Yeah, I can't recommend this book enough for anybody who's interested in true crime. Hauptmann's Ladder. The Kent State University Press. You can get it on audiobook also as well, and the link will be in this video's description. Richard Cahill, thank you so much for this interview.
You just mentioned the audiobook.
Mm-hmm.
When they did the audiobook, and it drives me crazy, the guy who was the wood expert, Arthur Kaler, the person who read it said Kohler, and it drives me crazy. So for the experts out there who think that I think his name is Kohler, I know his name is Kaler. It's just the way he read it, and that drives me crazy.
Okay, noted. It's just the actor or the reader of the audiobook, not you. All right, thanks. I've really enjoyed it. I had so many more questions. It's a really important book and one of the most prized book on my bookshelf. So thank you. It's an honor.
If you ever want to do a part 2 to ask me those other questions, just word.
I will. Thank you.
All right,
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye now.